Now from ABC4 Utah, a special presentation, Utah's Hidden History, honoring Black history.
Tonight, we are celebrating Black History Month with this edition of Hidden History. I'm Brittany Johnson. This past year, Utah saw a victory for civil rights, taking steps to remove all forms of slavery from our laws. This all started after I discovered a flaw in our Constitution. State Representative Sandra Hollins picked up the story and became the driving force behind the change. We followed her on the journey that got us to this point. Here it is in Utah's Constitution, Article 1, Section 21. The body of law clearly reads, slavery is forbidden. But keep reading, you'll see an exception. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within this state. When I discovered the law, I contacted Janetta Williams, president of the NAACP Salt Lake branch. November 2018, she called for the verbiage to be changed immediately.
What they're trying to get around saying that slavery is not okay, but then trying to say, but except. And that part there is very troubling.
Utah's Constitution is an adaptation of the U.S. Constitution, which also allows slavery as a punishment for crime. The 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865. It abolished most forms of slavery, but still allowed for the opportunity of servitude as legal punishment. And that has yet to change.
Prisons is not a form of slavery, and it shouldn't be a form of slavery.
After I broke the story, it caught the attention of Representative Sandra Hollins, the sole African-American member of the Utah legislature.
When you came out with the story and was like, well, Utah still has this on the books, I was like, oh, wow.
In January 2019, Representative Hollins opened a bill file. She wrote HJR 8, a proposal to amend Utah Constitution slavery and involuntary servitude prohibition. The goal, erase the outdated words from Utah's Constitution.
It doesn't reflect who we are. It doesn't reflect us as Utahns. It doesn't reflect us as Americans. It's a part of a dark past that many of us still don't want to hold conversation about, and it shouldn't be allowed in the Utah Constitution, and it shouldn't be in an American Constitution.
HJR 8 received bipartisan support through the 2019 legislative session.
Republican, Democrat, it shouldn't matter. As Americans, we should rally around individual liberty and freedom for all Americans.
Religious, non-religious, blacks, whites, you name it, they were here. And that's the way we have to do the people's business.
And support from activists, including Joan Mulholland, a freedom rider, held on death row for her involvement in the civil rights movement. She flew into Utah from Virginia during the last leg of the legislative session to drive home the point. Utah law needs an update.
There are things in our United States history that were wrong, and they need to be erased. Not forgotten, but erased from our current laws and documents and vocabulary.
Mulholland was there, fist in the air, side by side with Representative Hollins as the representative made history, a standing ovation. As the resolution passes the House unanimously, and finally off to the governor's desk where it was signed.
This is something that we can all agree on and something that brings us together.
Hollins wants to make it clear her resolution wouldn't stop prisoners from working, but sends a message that prison is not and should not be slavery. The resolution will appear on the November 2020 ballot. 2019 also marked 400 years since the first African slaves arrived on American shores. To commemorate, Salt Lake City dedicated the gravesite of an enslaved man who traveled to Utah with a group of pioneers in the early 1800s. Tom was born in Tennessee in year 1820 and was taken to Utah, where Mormon pioneer Abraham Smoot eventually inherited him. State Representative Sandra Hollins, whom you just met, hosted the dedication services at the city cemetery.
In August of 1619, the first Africans set foot on American soil in what was then Port Comfort. These individuals did not arrive in America by choice or by way of Ellis Island or Plymouth Rock, seeking a better life for themselves or their families, but instead as captured human cargo.
Tom died in 1862 at the age of 42. Still ahead on Hidden History, celebrating Black History Month. We'll take you to Old Point Comfort, where the first slaves were brought to America 400 years later. 400 years ago, the first captive Africans arrived on the shores of the British North American colonies. The place, what was then known as Point Comfort, is now Fort Monroe, Virginia. Throughout 2019, Fort Monroe held programs and ceremonies to recognize the 400-year-long journey in America. But as Cara Dixon reports, this is not a celebration, it's a commemoration.
Can you imagine 400 years ago being captured from Ndongo, Angola, and be placed aboard a slave ship, not knowing where your destination would be?
1619, the year the White Line sailed across the Atlantic and docked on these shores.
Arrived right here at Point Comfort. Today is Fort Monroe.
Now stands a historical marker in the place where Calvin Pearson looks out at the waters, where around 20 Africans were brought here against their will.
What was going through their minds, arriving at a location they didn't know where they were, arriving at a destination where they didn't know what their future would be?
That future would be marred with stories of discrimination and oppression for centuries through slavery and Jim Crow laws. But it was also filled with hope and perseverance through the Civil Rights Movement and the election of President Barack Obama.
400 years of history, 400 years of inventions, 400 years of achievement. So this is not a celebration, this is a commemoration.
To do that, Fort Monroe will hold programs and ceremonies throughout the year. It's something Park Superintendent Terry Brown says everyone should experience.
Yes, it's been a tough journey, but I want them to walk away with a sense of, wow, look how far we've come.
A long way from being dragged on shore, shackled in chains.
It's not just a Black story or African-American story, it's an American story. It truly is.
It's a story that needs to be told. It's a story that we should not be ashamed of, but it's a story that our ancestors, our descendants, it's a story that everybody should understand and recognize that the transgressions of one people among another people is something that should never be repeated.
And 400 years later, on a different August day, we remembered with their ancestors leading the way.
Not just about us, it's American history. And we know, without doubt, our ancestors are very proud of us because we are standing on their shoulders for all the years that we invested in putting this together. It was worth every bit of it.
And others felt that way too.
It's a day I'll really never forget.
Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax, honored to be invited by the line of William Tucker, the first African child born in the English colonies.
And they are the seeds that have planted our cultural growth for the last 400 years.
But it's not just the past we're reflecting on here. It's the future we want to make possible.
We're at the crossroads of history. We get to choose what the future looks like. And the people are speaking. And I think they're rising up and saying, we want something better. We want more hope, more opportunity for all. And that really is an inspiring message.
An inspiration that will serve for many years to come through the true story of America's foundation told here.
Utah commemorated 400 years of slavery as well with a Day of Healing. The sound of African drums reverberated on the Capitol steps. Members of the NAACP and local churches hosted the Day of Healing and Reconciliation. A bell tolled 4 times at midday, once for each century since slavery started in what would become the United States. Betty Sawyer, the president of the Ogden chapter of the NAACP, explains the significance of such an event.
The healing ceremony today is about healing from the atrocities of slavery, from the injustices, from those past wrongs, so that we're able to walk in the freedom and newness of the promises that our ancestors gave, as well as those that are in the Constitution of these United States.
There was a similar ceremony held at Second Baptist Church in Ogden, both part of the nationwide Day of Healing.
This is really about remembering her story.
Coming up, she's one of the most famous heroines you've probably never heard of. We'll introduce you to one woman's mission to make sure everyone remembers the name Suzie Baker King Taylor. Well, he marched for voting rights with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from Selma to Montgomery, and for over 40 years delivered Sunday sermons at Salt Lake City's Calvary Baptist Church. We're joined by Reverend France Davis. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And so I know you've stayed busy for the last few months here.
Absolutely.
So let's just jump right into this. Tell me, what was it like moving here to Utah back in the 1970s?
1970, I came from Berkeley. I had been previously in the military, and previous to that had been in the South, and came to Utah to discover that Utah was, in my view, at least 10, 20 years behind the rest of the world in terms of civil rights. Fair housing was not possible here. In fact, I was denied a place to stay when I first came. And there were lots of other issues that needed to be solved and settled here in Utah.
And you worked on some of those challenges to provide some solutions. Can you tell us about that?
Well, we started with the housing issue because I was denied a place to stay that I had reserved, that the university had provided me, and had a phone installed, but was denied a place to stay. So immediately I worked on the housing issue, and we finally got a fair housing bill passed at the Utah State Legislature. I also work with Ed Firmage and others on the MX missile, trying to ensure that we don't have weapons that of mass destruction that are available to our own government, and a number of other issues later, the Martin Luther King holiday bill and so forth.
So when it comes to challenges, what did you see? We just talked what you saw then, but have we come a long way from that point, and what do we still need to work on?
Well, I think we've come a long ways. I think we have gotten, for the most part, the laws on the books. We still have, though, the attitudes of people that need to be worked on, need to be refined, and they need to understand that there are these legal issues that need to be abided by.
And a couple months ago, you stepped down from the pulpit at Calvary Baptist Church. What was your last message? What did you want to leave with Utahns?
Well, December 29th was my last Sunday in the pulpit, and both at 8 a.m. and at 11 a.m. I talked about friendship. The Bible says that in order to have a friend, you must first show yourself friendly. Jesus said that if you that there's nobody that's any more friendly than a person that would lay down his life for another. And we've been, over the years, trying to make sure that we did things for the people, spiritually, first of all, but also whatever else caused people to hurt.
So we know you've done a lot of work in the community. Just because you retired doesn't mean you were stopping. What do you want your legacy to be?
Well, I'd like my legacy to remain as a legacy working to help the elderly and the very young, and then to bring the two together so that we become community.
All right, thank you so much, Reverend Davis, for joining us for our Hidden History program here. And we'll be right back with more Hidden History after this break. We're back with more Hidden History. Though often overlooked, the contributions of Suzie Baker King Taylor are undeniable. She was a trailblazer, a pioneer, an educator. Tonight, as we continue to celebrate Black History Month, Kim Gusby takes a closer look at her life through the eyes of one woman determined to share her story.
For some, the search for knowledge leads to unlikely places.
I came here on this quest looking for something, but what I came looking for was looking for me too.
That is the case of Hermina Glass Hill, a historian and writer who's made it her mission to elevate a story she says is seldom told, that of Suzie Baker King Taylor.
Harriet Tubman I know, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells I know, but I knew nothing of this incredible Suzie Baker King Taylor.
Born into slavery in Liberty County, Taylor made her mark as a Civil War laundress, freedom-fighting nurse, teacher, activist, and even author of her own autobiography. Incredible feats unheard of during a time when women and African Americans were marginalized.
She was a survivor. She went to Savannah at the age of 6 years old, and her grandmother, Dolly, who was a washerwoman between here and Savannah, had these connections. So she learned how to read at one of those secret schools in Savannah.
She utilized her knowledge to teach others, and by the age of 13, she escaped to freedom.
And my interest came when I began researching the United States colored troops. These are runaway men from southern plantations, free men from northern states who joined the Union Army in 1862 and fought for freedom and liberation of black people. And in that discovery, I discovered that there were black women who participated, and I stumbled upon her autobiography, which was published in 1902. And from there, this passion just grew. Before her introduction in that book, I knew nothing of her.
Glass Hill is now on a mission to make sure everyone knows her name. So she's spearheading a campaign, speaking to area schools and traveling the country to bring more attention to Taylor's accomplishments. She even left her hometown of Atlanta last year to take up residence in Liberty County.
The more I read about her, the more intrigued I became. And so I came down here to speak last February for Black History Month. And in coming here, my husband and I went to the Isle of Wight where she was enslaved. She mentions that in her autobiography. And I just started to walk the path that she might have taken. And the more I walked, the more this spiritual presence came upon me and said, you should move to Midway.
The Isle of Wight is also where Glass Hill finds inspiration. It's where Taylor is believed to have escaped to freedom, a major turning point that ultimately led to the liberation of others.
Her skills in the underground schools were used during the Civil War by the Union Army, and at that moment she became a teacher of hundreds of runaway children, men, women who were illiterate. And so if we look exponentially in terms of her influence, the hundreds of escaped slaves, runaways who learned how to read under her tutelage, and then they teaching their children, her influence is invaluable.
Now considered a premier scholar on Taylor's life, Glass Hill spends much of her time on research, scouring documents, even searching through cemeteries.
Found some bakers in this area who are potentially related to her. I found a younger brother of Suzie King Taylor at the Colonial Church less than a mile away.
And connecting the dots.
And Miss Suzie, so that's 3 from the bottom, so I counted 3 from the bottom here. And it's April the 18th, 1879. The date of the marriage is April 20th, 1879. And by whom married J.T.H. Waite, minister of the gospel. And we know that J.T.H. Waite was one of the ministers of our church. And that's how the connection was made.
With the help of the local community, Glass Hill has made a few other discoveries.
Suzie King Taylor was a member of this church. Its antecedent was Midway Temple Presbyterian Church, which was located in the cemetery across the street. She was married. I have her marriage records. I have the location of where her mother was after the Civil War.
With every revelation, Glass Hill says there's still mystery, but also an opportunity to learn and to grow.
This is really about remembering her story, remembering the horrors of slavery, and using all of this as a flashpoint for galvanizing the community around preservation of African American history, African American culture, African American historic sites.
Glass Hill is the founder and executive director of the Suzie King Taylor Institute and Ecology Center. This April, the first ever conference will be held to honor the 156th anniversary of her escape to freedom. Coming up on Hidden History, George Stowe. Stats are what baseball legends are made of, but he played in a time that put him in the shadows of the ballpark. We'll introduce you to the man historians call the greatest black pitcher of his time. If George Washington Stowe had been living today, he'd be a household name and a baseball player worth millions. Many baseball historians say Stowe was the greatest black pitcher of the 19th century, winning 33 games for the Newark Little Giants in 1887, a record that still stands in the International League. Lou Hunsinger Jr. wrote about Stowe's life for National Pastime magazine, documenting his pitching prowess.
Unfortunately, because the color line was drawn in 1887, he did not get a chance to play Major League Baseball. The New York Giants wanted to sign him, but there was pressure put on them not to sign him.
When he died, Stowe was considered a pauper, so his grave was unmarked, and it remained that way until a local, influential baseball fan brought a marker for him that said George Stowe, 1866 to 1936, ball player. Stowe was on a list of African-American players considered for Cooperstown's Baseball Hall of Fame a few years back, but never made it in. Here in Utah, sports and history are intertwined as well. Every year on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the Utah Jazz found a way to honor the civil rights icon. This year, the Utah Jazz played on Martin Luther King Day. The players wore special Martin Luther King shooting shirts, and the game hosted a basketball workshop for kids. The team's owner awarded the Larry H. Miller Education Scholarship at the 36th annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Luncheon. Well, thank you for watching this installment of Hidden History. To see these stories and more celebrating Black History Month, go to our website, abc4.com.